So on October 21st of 2021, Sony finally unveiled their long-awaited successor to the A7 III full-frame mirrorless camera, the A7 IV. I remember watching the live stream at the time, and they were talking about all of these awesome features, the increased resolution, the video codecs, and all of these great things that the camera was going to have. And I remember thinking, this camera is going to be like $5,000. It's going to be way out of my price range. And when they finally announced what the actual MSRP was, which was $2,500, I thought that was an unbelievable value, and I tried to get my hands on one as soon as I could. But unfortunately, I waited a little bit too long. I didn't really get in on any of the pre-orders, and I wound up having to wait a good number of months. I think it was probably 4 months, 4 or 5 months thereabout to actually get my hands on the camera. But ever since then, the A7 IV has basically been my primary shooter, and I've put over 25,000 photos on it in less than a year and have shot hours and hours of video footage on it. And so what I want to talk about today is, 1 year later, is this camera still worth it? Hey, I can't help but notice that you're not subscribed. If you're watching this video, it probably means you love photography or love filmmaking just like I do, and you're very interested in watching videos about it. And that's exactly what I do here on this channel. I've been a photographer and a videographer for many years, and I want to share some of that experience and be creative and create fun videos for you guys to enjoy. So if that's something that you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button and make sure you get the bell on so you know when a new video comes out. All right, let's get back to it. So I'm what you might consider a hybrid shooter, meaning I shoot both photos and videos at the same time. And so for me and other hybrid shooters like me, what that means is you can either have one kit that is only for photos and a completely separate kit that is entirely for video, and that's going to cost a lot of money to build out two entirely different photo and video kits. Or you can try to build a kit that finds balance between photo capability and video capability. So the way that I was doing that previously was I was shooting on an A7R II, the rather old and somewhat outdated 42 megapixel body, and a A7S III for video. But realistically, those two camera bodies were the absolute extremes of the two spectrums. So when the A7 IV came out, I immediately got rid of the A7S III, which is still kind of a regret of mine because I do love that camera and I do miss having the raw power of that camera to be able to shoot videos. But I replaced it with the A7 IV. So before we really talk about the experience of using the A7 IV for the past year or so, we do need to talk about the actual specs. And I'm sure you've seen these specs everywhere, so I'm just gonna go through them really quick. So when I say quick, I mean, I'm literally just gonna read off a few highlights from my phone. So it's 33 megapixels full frame sensor, 759 autofocus points with face detection, human and animal eye autofocus. I believe it has bird eye autofocus as well for those avid wildlife shooters. Tracking autofocus and a bunch of other autofocus modes. It can shoot up to 10 frames per second on continuous shooting. It has 5-axis image stabilization, a 1.04 million dot fully articulating viewfinder, which we're actually going to talk a lot about later. A 3.69 million dot electronic viewfinder, can shoot video in 4K 30 frames per second full frame, 4K 60 frames per second in crop mode, so an APS-C crop. It has S-Log2, S-Log3, HLG, as well as S-Cinetone color profiles, and it can shoot video in 422 10-bit internally to an SD card. Obviously an SD card that's fast enough to handle it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well later. So let's talk about the good parts. The first and probably one of the most important features to me is the improved autofocus. So when I was shooting on the A7S III, I actually found that kind of became a primary photo camera for me because of how good the autofocus was on it. And the autofocus on the A7 IV is in my opinion, a little bit better. Now, if you're jumping from an A7S III to an A7 IV, the autofocus is not that big of a difference, but going from an A7R II and switching over to the A7 IV, the difference is absolutely night and day. So in low light situations, the A7 IV does struggle a little bit more compared to a camera like the A7S III, but to be honest, that camera was so good in low light, it almost feels like I was a little bit spoiled with the low light performance of that camera. The A7 IV is a much more representative of what a good autofocus should do in a normal low light situation. But you'll still find that even in the darkest of situations, I've shot plenty of weddings and receptions that I had to light entirely by flash. It'll still find the autofocus eventually. It might take a couple tries, it might take some time for it to fully lock onto a point, but once it locks on, it actually does a really good job of staying locked on as long as you're tracking that subject and you don't lose it. So a big selling point for me, and I think for a lot of other hybrid shooters as well, was the inclusion of S-Cinetone and the improved color science on the A7 IV. A lot of cameras nowadays that have the ability to shoot video also have the ability to shoot in a log or a flat profile to allow you extra control in color grading. But for those of you that have been able to work with or shoot video using the S-Cinetone profile, you know that it's not a full log profile, but it still gives you enough room to apply color grades that it's just the easiest and most visually appealing baseline color profile for hybrid shooters that want to still be able to grade and apply their own styles to the color grades. Now, when it comes to color science, this camera absolutely blew my mind when it came to color science. I've shot on a lot of different cameras, and I've always noticed that the older Sony cameras, the generations around like the A7R II, the A7 IIIs, to a certain extent as well, had a bit of a magenta shift. It wasn't quite as natural feeling as the color science now. Now, talking about the video, the A7 IV has the ability to shoot internally in 10-bit 422 color space. And it can do that for all of the 4K resolutions as well as the 1080p resolution. And while we're not going to go too deep on what 422 is and why it's an improvement over 420 color space, all you need to know is that the ability to shoot 422 up until this point was something that was a huge selling point of the A7S III and what made it such a revolutionary and amazing camera for video shooters, but it was also something that was kind of always relegated to the very high-end and professional level workflows, was never really offered in even the most powerful consumer level camera. But now, for the hybrid shooters like myself that want that extra level of control and extra power when it comes to editing and grading your videos, can have that in the same body that can shoot 33 megapixel still photos at full frame, has super fast shooting speeds, and also a very impressive buffer. And speaking of the buffer, it's a very important feature for photo shooters, especially photo shooters that need to shoot a lot of photos in really quick succession. And you also need to be able to do that without running into the buffer and having to wait for your SD card and your camera to catch up with all the photos that you're taking. So let's talk about that buffer for a little bit, because the A7 IV can shoot uncompressed raw images at that full 10 frames per second with zero buffer whatsoever. Meaning you can shoot an unlimited number of images or until your SD card fills up, as long as you're using a CF Express card. Even if you're using a UHS-2 SD card, which are still very fast cards, you can still shoot up to 26 images uncompressed raw without ever hitting that buffer. And if you lower the quality down to like a JPEG or even like a high quality fine JPEG, you can still shoot with that unlimited buffer. You just won't have the ability to have all of those photos be raw files. This basically means that anything outside of really intense sports shooting, you're never realistically going to run into the buffer. And even when you do, and I've done it a few times at weddings, but even when you do hit the buffer, it actually clears the buffer very quickly. And considering that these are 33 megapixel photos that it's writing, and it's writing uncompressed raw photos at that, it's quite impressive how quickly it can clear out that buffer and you can get shooting again. So one thing that I do have to mention is the battery life. This camera uses the same battery as the A7S III, the A7R IV, any of the more up-to-date full-frame Sony bodies. And so what that means is the battery life is greatly improved versus the previous generation like the A7R II or the A7 III, even the A6000 crop sensor series. The body also has much better ergonomics. And quite frankly, on the topic of battery life, I find that 2 batteries is enough to get me through an entire wedding. Now, shooting video as well off the bat, I don't know what the battery life is for continuous shooting. The camera does overheat every once in a while in sustained shooting, and if it's in like a hot room like this and if there's nothing to cool it, it will overheat. So I've never actually hit the battery limit on shooting with it, but considering how good the battery life is when you're shooting photos, I personally have no problem just going out to a video shoot with the same 2 or 3 batteries, and I feel like I can shoot all day as long as it's not just continuously rolling. So let's talk about the resolution real quick. 33 megapixels is not a huge improvement over 24, which is what the previous A7 III had, but having a slightly higher resolution and higher megapixel count does give you a huge amount of flexibility when it comes to editing and adjusting the crop of your photos. So when I was shooting with the A7S III, I mentioned that it became kind of my primary camera, so I was shooting a lot of photos on it as well because the autofocus was so good and it was just so easy to use. But I ran into a pretty major problem when I started editing the photos because some of the photos that I was delivering to clients, if I had to adjust the crop a little bit, went from 12 megapixels to effectively 9 or 10 megapixels by just cropping a little bit off the image. Now, if you look at a 100% zoom on the A7R II and the A7 IV, the difference is a little bit negligible. You do notice that one is maybe slightly higher res than the other, but it's not a huge difference. Now, if we look at the A7S III, the 12 megapixel photo is drastically blurrier and drastically lower resolution than the other photos. Now, in practice, does this matter? Depending on how you're delivering the photos and where you're viewing them, if you're looking at them on social media, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. If you're putting them up on a computer screen or a TV screen, you're not going to tell a huge difference unless you have a big screen. And if you're printing your photos, again, unless you're printing a huge print, you're not really going to notice. That print up there of Zion is actually, it was taken on the A7S III, but I think that's a 12 by 17 or something print, and even if you look really close to it, you're not going to notice any real difference in resolution when it comes to the print. Again, does it make a huge difference? No, but if your clients zoom into your photos when they're looking at them on the computer and they notice that it looks really blurry when they zoom in, they might have some questions for you if you're taking that low resolution. So again, it's not a huge difference. It's a very much just a nice to have type of thing. Now, honestly, one of the most exciting features for the A7 IV was that fully articulating flip out screen that I'm actually using to monitor myself right now. And you might be thinking, well, oh, it's just they're catering to the vloggers and they're catering to all the people that, you know, want to film themselves with a very expensive camera and be YouTubers. But what I've actually found is that the flip out screen is hugely useful for anything from taking a high shot of a crowd to a really low angle if you don't want to crouch down and, you know, do this whole thing to get your eye into the viewfinder. Yes, it is very nice to have like that vlog style flip out where I can use it like I am now to monitor myself and make sure the exposure is correct without having to, you know, attach a whole separate monitor to it. It's a nice to have, but I've actually found it more useful in a lot of the professional use cases than just for something like vlogging. So let's talk about some of the bad stuff. The LCD, even though the flip out feature and the fully articulating feature is really nice, the LCD and the electronic viewfinder do leave something to be desired. The electronic viewfinder is far improved over the A7S III, which was noticeably blurry and was actually difficult to tell where you were focusing at times. It does still make me want a little bit better resolution out of it. Now, the brightness on the electronic viewfinder is actually great because you're putting your eye so close to it, but the brightness on the LCD, especially when you're shooting out in bright daylight, is actually not anywhere near where it needs to be. I found myself in certain situations, especially when shooting video out in bright daylight, not being able to see what my picture looked like. And it was mainly because the glare from the glossy screen, which is necessary in order to have a touch screen, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second, but two, just the output brightness of the LCD is not, it does leave something to be desired, especially in those bright daylight situations. So let's talk about that touch screen for a little bit. The touch screen is nice to have. It's fine. I don't particularly care for it. I think it's a bit of a gimmick. It's cool to be able to do something like that where you touch and pull focus to a different area, but if you really want to have that kind of control, you're probably using manual focus anyway. This camera and this camera body, the design of it specifically, did a really cool thing, which is Sony added the joystick control on the back of the camera. Basically, for any time you're changing the focus point or changing the menu navigation, or you want to change, like, navigate anything on the camera, you've got this little joystick that's right where your thumb naturally wants to be. It's a much more convenient and easy way to adjust and to interact with the camera versus the touchscreen. Now, the other bad thing, if you can really even call it that, is the price point of this camera. For the amount of features that you're getting from it, from how powerful of a camera it is, from how great it is at video and how great it is in photo, how amazing the autofocus is, the eye autofocus, the animal autofocus, the bird autofocus, all of these incredible, powerful features, $2,500 is still a great value. But $2,500 is for the body alone. It doesn't come with any of the full frame lenses, which are also really expensive if you're looking at Sony native. And it very quickly pushes this camera pretty far away from the general or like entry level market. Is that really a bad thing? No, I know it's in the bad things section of this video, but I don't really think it's a bad thing because it is still a great value for what it is. Now, the last bad thing that I'm going to talk about, and again, this is super nitpicky considering how great of a value this camera is, the 4K 60 video is at an APS-C crop, so it's not shot using the full sensor. It crops in 1.5 times to an APS-C sensor size, and basically whatever lens you're using, it crops in by 50%. So the 24 millimeter that I'm shooting on now would be like a 36 millimeter when you're using the 4K 60. Now, even at a crop, again, it's still 4K. You get that 60 frames per second, so it's a lot easier to stabilize the footage. It's a lot easier to slow it down a little bit. If you want to do real slow-mo, you do have the 1080p at 120 frames per second, and that is full frame, but it would have been nice to have 4K 60 at full frame. Again, it's super nitpicky. It's already such a great value. If they had to sacrifice on the video frame rate or crop for a 4K 60, I'm perfectly fine with that. Obviously, I still have the thing after a year. So after all of that, we have still yet to answer the question of, is this camera worth it? A year later of shooting on it, is it worth it? And if you've watched all the way through up until this point, it should be no surprise to you that the answer is a resounding yes. So I've shot on a lot of different cameras and used a lot of different camera ecosystems, Nikon, Canon, Panasonic, Sony, you name it. And quite honestly, I've never had a camera that does everything that I need to all in one camera until this one. So at the end of the day, I think this is the perfect hybrid camera. Even if you're solely a photographer, I think this could be the perfect photo camera for you as well. And if you're solely a video shooter, I think this could be the perfect video camera for you as well. It does everything in both camps so incredibly well. And for $2,500, again, just the body, but at that price point, it's such a good value and so versatile and powerful that I really don't think anyone will regret buying this.